On the previous episode, I discussed some winners and losers around free agency, but the focus was on the vacuum, so to speak. Did things get better or worse for that player? Today, everything is about the market. I've done some buy sell segments on this show before with NFL players, but today, everyone will at least be related to transactions in the NFL this past week. In order to judge the market, I'm going to use a few sources, including Keep Trade Cut, which has aggregate rankings, Fantasy Calc, which has the same thing, but also a list of real trades I can use as price examples, and a chart found on Reddit and Twitter/X, posted by Alex Korf, or at peaked in high school _FF, high school being HS. So at peaked in HS _FF. So if you want to see that chart that I might refer to a couple times, that is where you can find it. So up first, I have a couple of new fantasy football stacks, starting with Will Levis and Calvin Ridley. Now, I'm more confident in Ridley as a long-term option just in general, as in I think he's going to be more likely to be a good player over the next 2-3 years. But the Titans have been doing a very nice job this offseason of putting a nice situation around Will Levis. And generally speaking, I think the quarterback position is probably more volatile than we give it credit for, considering how many of the more higher drafted quarterbacks in Superflex leagues the last few years have ended up being more busts than we've expected. And so, while I'm still not completely confident individually in the talent of Will Levis, with two good running backs, Calvin Ridley, and then what Calvin Ridley does to push down guys like DeAndre Hopkins, Treylon Burks, Kyle Phillips even, to being tertiary options, secondary options, I think that does a lot and goes a long way to helping with Will Levis and building out Will Levis. It's also worth noting that in the draft, they could be in a very nice position to get someone like Joe Alt, who would be a 6'8" tackle that could help Will Levis in the long term. So Will Levis trades I've seen some trades involving Will Levis and Justin Fields still. It's hard to know how exactly stale the takes or the value is Justin Fields or with Justin Fields, but if that's something you could do, I'm not saying even straight up, but like giving something alongside Justin Fields to get Will Levis, that's absolutely something I would try to explore. Will Levis for a random 2025 first, I will say, and I've said this a few times on this show, I am personally not a very big fan of the 2025 quarterback class, and I do believe that is at least close to a consensus. So at least in terms of a quarterback, you could very easily make the argument that Will Levis will be better than any quarterback you might be able to get next year with a 2025 first round pick. I've also seen a lot of trades with Will Levis being traded for older starting quarterbacks. Now that's something I would do on both sides depending on if I'm contending or rebuilding, but I think that's a nice move for a rebuilder if you have like a Geno Smith or somebody else that somebody might value as a contending quarterback, maybe even like an Aaron Rodgers or something like that, maybe even a Kirk Cousins. Some of these older quarterbacks, you might be able to give them away if you're rebuilding and get back a Will Levis, maybe a little bit more, and that at least brings some upside that can maybe kickstart your rebuild. Basically, at the end of the day, the big way to describe these trades that I'm seeing for Will Levis is that some of these trades, or a lot of these trades, where you're getting him without giving a big asset. Some of them you're giving two things, some of them you're giving three things, some of them you're giving, say, 25 seconds, and A.J. Dillon was one of the trades on Fantasy Calc. And then a 2024 second and third round pick, right? You're giving these kind of things to the Will Levis manager. You're not giving up first round picks as often, or you're just giving up single first round picks in future years. So not big tier assets for Will Levis. And so being able to get a quarterback who does have upside and does have a good situation around him, that is something that's extremely intriguing to me at his current market value that does not seem to be going up at all. And I've talked about Calvin Ridley quite a bit. I just talked about Will Levis a lot, so I won't go into Calvin Ridley too much. I just think the main point that I have is that I don't think the market took into consideration enough the risk associated with a player who had only played 5 games in 2 years last year. And maybe this is just my own narratives, maybe this is just me making things up, but it feels to me sometimes like when the market gets things wrong, they hold it against the player and they say, no, we weren't wrong, you were just worse than you were supposed to be. And to me, that's not actually what happened last year. Calvin Ridley had a fairly reasonable season within expectations, or what expectations should have been. So, given that I do believe that playing 17 games last year is an overall positive, and probably a bigger positive than the market gives it credit for, considering that the market also didn't consider it very much of a negative that he had only played 5 games the previous 2 seasons. I really like Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley is also one of those keep it simple stupids for me, where let's look at just very simple things. What's his age? What's his position? How much money did he get on a contract that's very fresh, so it's a recent evaluation? And how many fantasy points has he scored per game in his entire career? When you put these 4 categories together, now he's not the youngest guy, but he's under 30. He's not in the greatest situation, but he should have targets coming at him. Wide receiver, valuable position that you can expect a player to play well, at least until maybe 30, 31 years old. All of these things line up with his career points per game, which I don't have the exact number, but I think we all understand who Calvin Ridley has been on average per game over the course of his entire career. This is a player that should not be valued where he is on most market aggregates right now. And then I don't want to spend too much time on this next pair, but I will say this is a bit more of a redraft take for me. I think these are 2 players that the more I think about it, the more I think these are going to be targets for me in certain redraft leagues. But George Pickens and Russell Wilson is another stack that I would consider targeting. I'm a little surprised George Pickens' price hasn't raised anymore. I have seen a little bit of a bump, but nothing very significant. And I think that's because people just really dislike Russell Wilson right now. And I think there's fair reasons for that. But there's really no comparison. Even the stats he put up in 2022, I'm pretty sure, would be favorable to what the Pittsburgh Steelers had last year. But the stats that Russell Wilson put up in 2023 are definitely preferable to the stats that the Pittsburgh Steelers quarterbacks put up the last year and really the last 2 years or few years, since Big Ben, and even Big Ben was a result of just a ton of pass attempts, generating a ton of targets at the end of his career. I think there's a genuine argument here that Russell Wilson, and I'm sorry Steelers fans that I do believe this is true, but I believe there's a genuine argument that for fantasy, Russell Wilson's the best quarterback that they've had in Pittsburgh since a few years before the end of Ben Roethlisberger's career. I think he's better than late career Ben Roethlisberger. Maybe I'm just really far off on that, and I'll get to this in just a second, but there's a significant portion of the market who just believes that Russell Wilson is Justin Fields fodder, and maybe they're right on that. But when I look at the volume that Russell Wilson's put up even the last 2 years, that's an upgrade for me, and he also seems to match stylistically with George Pickens. So I do think there's some things that I still don't love at a high price buy for George Pickens. Not that he's quite there yet. And that's why I think I say George Pickens might be a little bit more of a redraft target than a dynasty target for me. But at the end of the day, he's a young player who's a redraft target. So I'm not going to leave him off this list because I do think the situation is being a little bit underrated. And in that context, do I think there is a significant chance that Russell Wilson gets benched for Justin Fields? Yes, I do. But I think the market wants it to happen too bad. And when the market wants something to happen, they start to make objective values or put what they want to happen into their objective values. And what I've seen right now is that there's too much value being put on Justin Fields as a potential starter still. And there's not enough value or a knock-in value on Russell Wilson. And I get that financially, because of the way the contract situation worked out, that they did not have to pay Russell Wilson basically anything. And he still gets all the money that he could ever want because he's getting the offsets from the Denver Broncos. I totally understand how that can, change the situation, since the Pittsburgh Steelers aren't beholden to him in any kind of financial way in terms of an investment that they themselves have made. But at the end of the day, I don't think the Pittsburgh Steelers are putting up a front right now. I think they're saying that Russell Wilson's the starter because they genuinely really want Russell Wilson to be the starter. I think they think that is better for their competitive window, and I think they're trying to make sure that the fan response isn't to immediately crown Justin Fields. I think that's why they're being so clear, but I don't think that's because they're setting it up for an open competition or anything. And to be clear, I don't think most people say that, but I think some people talk as if there's going to be a really quick leash. Russell Wilson's going to come out there, throw 5 passes, and then if they're not good, someone's going to come with the cane and yank him off the stage. And I just don't see that happening. I think Russell Wilson's going to get a little bit of a leash here. And if he plays as well as he did last year on a team that plays a lot of defense, chokes the clock, plays slow, and doesn't actually put as much on him as a lot of other teams would do, I think there's a chance that he starts the whole season. And if Russell Wilson starts the whole season, he's a value at the price he's available at right now, at least for a contender. Obviously, there's certain players you would never buy. 37-year-old quarterbacks or whatever his age is now, you're probably never buying those as a rebuilder. But as a contender, yeah, that's something that you might be able to buy if you're questioning the stability maybe of your quarterback 2 spot. Maybe you had Justin Fields. Instead of being the Russell Wilson manager who's trying to get Justin Fields, maybe there's a Justin Fields manager who needs that quarterback too. And I think Russell Wilson is a fairly viable trade target for that situation. So next up, DeAndre Swift, the running back for the Chicago Bears. I think there's a couple psychological things going on here, and I don't mean to go so far into these, but when it comes to the market, I have to answer the question of why are these guys off on the market? And I think sometimes the reason that players are off on the market is because they burned other fantasy managers. And I think that's the first thing going on with DeAndre Swift. I think you can see this in players like DK Metcalf and Mike Evans throughout his career, where you get up to a certain point and then you don't necessarily live up to that first round redraft expectation every year. And then we end up putting you way too low because you didn't live up to the expectation we once had. And I'm someone who sold DeAndre Swift in a league on the basis of the Eagles news. And I can tell you that my view on DeAndre Swift has massively changed multiple times throughout his career. And maybe that's what you want to say is a negative. But the fact of the matter is that I think the second psychological thing is that when all of these contracts for DeAndre Swift, for Tony Pollard, for Josh Jacobs, when they all came out at the same time, it made it harder to differentiate between them. And now that all the money has come out, DeAndre Swift has more guaranteed money than Josh Jacobs. Josh Jacobs' contract looks better. And frankly, if I were betting, it probably has the kind of incentives that DeAndre Swift might prefer it to that contract. So I don't want to say that DeAndre Swift's contract is better because Josh Jacobs' contract, at least theoretically, seems to have a lot more upside. But DeAndre Swift has a higher total guarantee than Josh Jacobs. DeAndre Swift's contract is harder to get out of after year 1 than Josh Jacobs. At least the numbers that I've seen reported, the amount of cap saving would be lower with DeAndre Swift after year 1 than it would be with Josh Jacobs. And it was reported to be very similar numbers to the Tony Pollard deal. And now it doesn't seem like it's nearly as similar to the Tony Pollard deal as it originally seemed. And so these amounts are very different. And then if you want to add a third psychological thing, the fact that people like Roschon Johnson and Khalil Herbert. But to me, none of these things matter anymore. The fact that I sold him once because I thought he was done, the fact that I've overpaid for him before because I thought he was great, the fact that he was a low cost investment to the Eagles when he was getting his second chance. None of these things matter anymore. He's under a new contract with the Bears, almost guaranteed to be there 2 years, almost guaranteed to have priority now over Roschon Johnson and Khalil Herbert. And he will not be 27 yet when those 2 years end. And the deal goes for 3 in total. But in those first 2 mostly guaranteed years, he's going to be, he just turned 25, so he'll be 25 for the whole first year, turning 26 just after it, and he'll be 26 for the whole second year, turning 27 just after it. So this is still a very, very young running back. So considering the fact that the Bears also aren't going to have to pay the quarterback position anytime soon, and those investments are hopefully going to go, hopefully as a Bears fan, to the offensive line, I think DeAndre Swift is a very big buy and in the wrong tier entirely when you look at the marketplace of running backs right now, because I think the contract is a little underrated, and I think there's a couple people out there who are just a little burned by him. So he's tiered below guys like Rachaad White, Kyren Williams, Devon Achane, and I'm not saying I would take him necessarily over all these players, but he deserves to be in that tier to me. Basically the tier that's outside of the elite young running backs / CMC. Outside of that tier, I think DeAndre Swift is basically just as good as anybody right now in the dynasty running back market. Next up, a couple players I've talked about a few times in the show. Again, I keep saying this, don't know if I'm actually doing it, probably not, but going to try to go a little quick through Christian Kirk because I've talked about him a few times. But I think Christian Kirk has been underrated in that he's been very good since the 2021 season, and he had only 2 bad games in the 2023 season before getting hurt as well. And even without taking aside things like the bad games, the 2021 to 2023 sample at this point is very, very solid for Christian Kirk, a player who still has maybe 2 seasons in total before turning 30 years old in the 3rd season, during that 3rd season. So that's still a player who, that's why Christian Kirk to me is one of my favorite contender buys, because a lot of these contender buys, like Keenan Allen, right? The same concern I have with the Bears themselves with Keenan Allen is that wide receivers over 32 in new situations, that's a very risky profile. All of these potential contender buys that you have right now out there on the market that have big names, a lot of these guys I think have a lot more fall off risk given their age than someone like Christian Kirk, who might not be able to get penciled in for more than say 1,100, 1,000, 1,100 yards, maybe 1,200 if you're lucky. Maybe those other guys do have a little bit of upside beyond that, but if you can pencil that in potentially for the next 3 years, at least on a per game basis when healthy, which I think there's at least a good chance of at least 2, maybe 3 years on that, that's worth it as a contender buy right now for the price. Now, the only thing I need to add with Christian Kirk is I do think there's a solid chance the Jaguars add a wide receiver that drops his value. So I think he's a buy right now regardless, but I think I might wait right now because I think Christian Kirk's value might drop if they get a wide receiver. And then if they get a wide receiver, there's not really any single wide receiver that scares me in this situation because I think he can still be the number 2 over Gabe Davis. So I'm probably still going to be buying him, even if they trade, say, significant draft capital for Brandon Ayuk or T. Higgins, which I think are the top 2 scary options by far, because these guys aren't probably getting a top 3 wide receiver in the rookie class. And then Nico Collins. Nico Collins doesn't really truly fit this. It's just moves that haven't been made, and the fact that the Houston Texans did trade away their 1st round pick. In a sense, they traded back to the 2nd round pick in that deal with the Minnesota Vikings. But the big thing with Nico Collins is just the fact that I believe he's more of a true top 10, top 8, top 5 wide receiver, maybe even in football and definitely in fantasy right now compared to where his market value is. So I don't want to spend too much time on that because that one really has almost nothing to do with transactions either. But Nico Collins, a little bit to do with transactions, but a big time buy for me. The last big buy I have on this list, and his teammate is getting a lot of credit for the quarterback change in Atlanta, but Kyle Pitts is not. And I think, again, I don't like to make psychological arguments because they're so unobjective. And I like to be objective on this show as much as possible to make arguments that people can grasp onto and hold on to tangibly. But I can't help but see all of these players that are really, really talented, that have a lot of upside and have new things coming into their situations that can unlock that upside, and investments still that matter to that upside. And then just saying, like, I just can't do it with Kyle Pitts. I've been burned too many times. I understand that more than just emotionally or empathetically. Like, I understand how seeing a player be bad in the past is going to influence what we expect them to do in the future. But ultimately, Drake London doesn't have that good of stats in his first 2 years. They're good in certain ways, but they're not good in other ways that we are looking for and count for, especially in terms of being great, right? They're good, they're not great. And every single thing we're saying about why we're pumping up Drake London is he has all these excuses, and those excuses are about to go away. Well, Kyle Pitts has played in the exact same offense. It's not like they're playing on 2 different Atlanta Falcons teams. And so as much as, Drake London should be valued more than Kyle Pitts, that's not the point. The point is that if the same situations are changing for both players, then they should have at least somewhat of a relatively similar change in the market. And right now, the market change is not only not relatively similar, but it is completely night and day differently, to the point where, now don't get me wrong, there's probably more than a few Kyle Pitts managers out there who are so excited by this that he's now way harder to get, but it does seem like the general market sentiment right now is nothing like the Drake London market sentiment, where all of the skepticism seems to be firmly placed on Kyle Pitts. And I guess that's the point where I break off both on Kyle Pitts and, to get to him in a bit, Drake London, because I don't believe that that's a fair way to balance out the skepticism. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be a little bit more on Pitts than it is, say, on London on both of their relative skeptical levels. But it seems like everyone's saying, like, I'm 95% skeptical about Pitts and 5% is the offense. And I'm 80% skeptical about the offense with London and only like 20% is with London. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, I think you can be skeptical about the idea that Drake London can be good, but not necessarily elite, because we haven't seen that yet, and be skeptical that maybe part of that is on him too, to a greater extent than the market's being right now, making Drake London a sell, while also saying, because of the fact that the market is saying, well, we don't really trust Kyle Pitts anymore. We don't care that the situation's changed in this situation. We don't care about that at all. We only are skeptical about Kyle Pitts. I think that's a situation where you just got to go, well, the one I'm selling is the one that other people are buying, because that's Drake London. And the worst case scenario when you buy players who get this hot, generally speaking, is that you get something else very good. I don't mean to make it like a cop-out or something, but I think so many people who struggle with the idea of doing something like this, and by something like this, I don't mean, giving Drake London for just picks, right? I mean going to a Nico Collins or tearing down to an older player like a DK Metcalf and getting picks on top of the DK Metcalf player, or getting a lot of picks on top of the T Higgins player with all the skepticism in his marketplace right now. Those are moves that, even if Drake London hits at a very high level, could still end up being decently net positives or net neutrals or small net negatives, because it's not just about what you're giving up, it's about what you're getting. And when you're selling players who are as valuable as Drake London, you have a chance to get a lot. So I've kind of crossed between sections here to transition myself into the sells, but just to recap where I was at the end of the buys. Kyle Pitts, buy for me, because I think too much skepticism is being placed solely on Kyle Pitts when some of that was the fault of his offense. And on the other side of things, I think too much skepticism is being placed solely on the offense when I think we should still be skeptical about Drake London, a guy who 2 years in his career hasn't broken 1,000 yards. Not saying it's his fault or his fault entirely, but until we see him do certain things, I don't think we should just assume that he can do them as high of a level as we just sort of expect. So that's why Pitts is a buy and London is a sell for me. Another extremely controversial sell. I'm sure a lot of people will love these first two sells, and I do think a lot of people are going to call this an overreaction, so just stick with me a bit because it is very particular. But if I can tear down to certain quarterbacks, I do believe there is a legitimate reason to be skeptical about Justin Herbert. And I don't like saying that. I really don't like saying that. I feel like Justin Herbert is a player that you want to feel safe about, and you should feel safe about. And you should be able to, you should feel like trading him away, even for the moves I'm going to discuss, is an incredibly risky thing. But when you just look at the history of Harbaugh, and you just look at the history of Roman, and you just look at the wide receiver histories in their offense, and you just look at the passing histories in their systems, this is a team that believes that you run the ball to use the smallest number of plays possible and then make sure that your quarterback is in the right situation at the end of games. That wins a lot of games. But the number one thing that people don't really realize sometimes, I think, is when you choke the crap out of the clock, you take away plays themselves. It's not just the fact that you're running instead of passing the ball, it's that you're not running plays at all. And then Justin Herbert doesn't run the ball at the goal line at all, so he's less likely to get goal line touchdowns as well as a runner or get rushing yards. And so there is a lot of safety in Justin Herbert. But I keep asking myself, sometimes you just got to ask yourself some very simple questions, especially when everybody's around the same age, where age isn't really much of a question. And I asked myself today, if you're doing your redraft rankings, who's higher, Kyler Murray, Jordan Love, or Justin Herbert? And it's not Justin Herbert, and it's not Justin Herbert by a tier. I think Jordan Love and Kyler Murray are guys I like at a tier higher than Justin Herbert right now in redraft leagues. And frankly, if they get Marvin Harrison Jr., that's not going to change it, because that's just one really good wide receiver. That's still not going to change the entire philosophy of the team. And Marvin Harrison Jr. can even be the best wide receiver they've ever seen. But if he's the guy who's getting a huge proportion while Justin Herbert isn't throwing the ball that much, that's still not going to be a great outcome overall for fantasy. And I don't personally see, as I've talked about on a previous show, that much risk personally with Kyler Murray and Jordan Love. So is it a bit risky? Is it surely to be controversial because of who Justin Herbert is and how safe he's been locked in to that early mid first round superflex? Absolutely. But I can't in good conscience look at 3 quarterbacks who are roughly the same age as each other and say that the 2 that are going to score, in my opinion, more points in redraft leagues should be taken below the other guy because his name is bigger and he's been in the middle of superflex first rounds for longer. So to me, if I can take Justin Herbert and trade him specifically for like a Kyler Murray or Jordan Love, or if you yourself like somebody else, say like Tua Tagovailoa, that you like at the same tier as I like those 2 guys right now. I'm a little bit lower on Tua than those 2 guys right now for a couple of associated reasons that we don't need to get into right now. The point being, if you feel the same way about another quarterback in this range, I would tear down from Justin Herbert to that quarterback, see what I can get out of it, because he's still considered a mid first round pick. Someone might think you're panic selling, and I honestly feel like a lot of the best deals I've ever made is when someone has thought that I was panic selling. So at the end of the day, if someone thinks that you're panicking about Justin Herbert and that can get you a profit in the long run because Jordan Love ends up putting up just as many points next year but just isn't as big of a name, that's a profit you might be able to take advantage of right now. Next up on the sells, I have Rachaad White. It is semi-related, obviously, because no moves happened, but I think the big reason it's related to being a sell is that a lot of running backs got really nice contracts that doubled down on their careers, reaffirmed their careers, and yes, some of them are a bit older than Rachaad White, but the fact that Rachaad White is over pretty much all of them still, in at least the market aggregates that I look at, is a mistake to me. And I get that he's younger, but just the fact that he's on the rookie contract shouldn't really make him that much more valuable, because for one, he wasn't the youngest rookie coming into the league. He is about the exact same age as DeAndre Swift. Now he is, say 2 years younger than some of these other guys like Joe Mixon, but with the contract and contract extension that say Joe Mixon got, Joe Mixon's probably just as safe, if not safer, than Rachaad White. I know that there's a longevity argument with Rachaad White, but for the running back position, that's just not a longevity argument I care about all that much. So when I look at all of these running backs that got re-upped that aren't going to have teams theoretically, because there is a chance that Rachaad White has a player drafted at his position more so than a lot of these guys who got new contracts. So if I can tear down Rachaad White to one of these guys that just got a fresh contract, I'm going to go after the fresh contract player instead of holding on to Rachaad White. And then 2 players that have questionable markets so far, Zamir White and Gus Edwards. Again, I haven't seen big deals for these players, but these are kind of the definition of players that I would be kind of actively shopping, because the trades that I could at least theoretically angle out of them between their potential jobs right now, their potential roles, are things that I'd be interested in. Zamir White in particular does have single year and even potentially beyond single year upside if the Raiders don't do anything substantial at the running back position. But at the end of the day, there's such a significant risk. If Zamir White gets drafted over significantly, your stock just kind of went to nothing and you have nothing. If you trade Zamir White right now, say for draft picks that you don't have to spend until after the draft, you can bust on the draft picks, but as a commodity, they're much safer to hold through the draft. They're going to hold their value through the draft. Sometimes they do go up or down a little bit, but they're not going to crater as values through the draft like Zamir White could crater as a value through the draft. And if you want to avoid the risk entirely too, you can potentially trade for future picks or something like that where you can hold on to safer value for a longer period of time. So there's a lot of upside with holding on to something like Zamir White. I'm somebody who always likes to cash out on the Zamir Whites and the Gus Edwards because I want to avoid stocks that truly hit zero, and the only stocks I want to be willing to let truly hit zero are the ones on on players like Devontae Adams, who are at the end of their careers, and you're trying to win more titles and more titles and more titles, and you're just saying, you know what, no one's going to give me what I want for one of the best players that I've had the last 3 years because he's well over 30 now, and so screw it, I'm just going to keep playing Devontae Adams instead of selling him. That's when I'm okay with holding players through zero. But most of the other time where I see significant zero risk in a player, that's a sell to me. And Zamir White has way too much significant zero risk to be holding and hoping for me right now. Next up, Hollywood Brown, and Hollywood Brown's kind of a tricky one to me because the aggregates I'm seeing have not necessarily matched with the comments I've seen. And that says to me potentially that there's a very volatile market out there right now, but that also means that if you can find the guy who believes in Hollywood Brown, who believes Hollywood Brown is the new Tyreek Hill, you go after that guy. Because if you can find one of the people who truly believes, like, for example, I've seen people say that they would take Hollywood Brown clearly over Calvin Ridley. I brought that one up on the last show. I also saw somebody today who said that they believed it was very clear that Hollywood Brown would be the wide receiver 1 over Rashee Rice. Now, again, these are just random comments for the most part, but if there's enough heat on the market that people just believe that Hollywood Brown is now capable of basically anything because now he can be comped to Tyreek Hill in this offense, then that's something that I'm going to look around all other 11 managers in my league and try to say, hey, can I find the one guy or the two guys in this league who really, really believe in Hollywood Brown? If I can only get the aggregate from the market, if I can only get a low, wide receiver 3 price, I'd rather have Calvin Ridley. So I'd try to do that still, but I'd be fine just holding on to Hollywood Brown. There is some upside there, but most likely I believe I'm going to be able to find someone in my league who's willing to play significantly more than I am for a career that ultimately has, the big thing that I would say with Calvin Ridley is that Calvin Ridley in his disappointing year last year had 1,018 yards. And Hollywood Brown's never had 1,018 yards. So that's kind of a big difference right there. Hollywood Brown's been one of those players who's retained value more than put up production. Is that going to change this year? I don't know, but that's been his whole career. That didn't just start when he got to Kansas City. He's been that player for his entire career. Part of it is injuries and per game stuff, but at the same time, part of it isn't. Part of it's just failure to live up to expectations. And so that is why Hollywood Brown is a sell for me. So that's all I have for this clip from the Fantasy for Real podcast. If you enjoyed this clip, make sure to check out the full show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I should have a Tyrone Tracy video coming out on Monday, so stay tuned for that, and I will see you next time.